So I'm just delighted to welcome you all and thank you for joining us to have with us tonight Dr. Jarlath Killeen, who is an expert in Victorian literature with a particular emphasis on Irish Gothic literature, which we're very excited about. He teaches currently at Trinity College, Dublin. And of course, you are all here because of Bram Stoker and his most famous creation, Dracula. There are scores of academic studies of this novel, but Stoker himself remains a figure shrouded in darkness, and his other writings can sometimes, be ignored. So tonight's lecture will look at Bram Stoker, the man behind the vampire, and Dr. Killeen will discuss his influences in writing Dracula, the importance of his Irish background and how that influenced the story. And then he will also kind of have a quick look at how the Count himself has been treated in popular culture, but also literary criticism. So it's a wide-ranging talk, and I'll minimize myself, and hopefully Dr. Killeen will get through it, and I'll see you at the other side. Those of you who are online, you can type a question on the Q&A down here at the bottom, and we'll be able to answer them at the end. Okay, so take it away. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Elizabeth, and I'm delighted to be joining you from Ireland tonight. It's late in Ireland, but it's great to be talking about Dracula and Bram Stoker at Halloween. So I'm going to talk a bit about biography first, because writing Bram Stoker's biography is a difficult task for anyone. A biography appears to be quite a compelling genre for many people, as public appetite for it is absolutely huge. I was just looking at the New York Times bestseller list today, the non-fiction bestseller list, and out of the top 10 on that list, 5 of them could be called biographies or memoirs of some form or another. So people are clearly kind of obsessed a bit with reading about people's lives, particularly celebrities' lives. Now, famously, one of Bram Stoker's contemporaries, Oscar Wilde, didn't really like biographers at all. He complained in one of his essays that biographers are what he called the mere body snatchers of literature. He complained that we are overrun by a set of people who, when a poet or painter passes away, arrive at the house along with the undertaker and forget that their one duty is to behave as mutes. People were certainly unable to stop talking about Oscar Wilde even while he was alive, and there's dozens now biographies about Oscar Wilde, and they keep piling up year after year after year. But at least with Oscar Wilde, we have a whole wealth of material to draw on when we're writing a biography. There's a huge volume of primary material that a biographer can draw on in order to paint a picture of Wilde. In order to answer the basic question of all biographies, which is like, who is Oscar Wilde in this particular case? I think the interesting comparison that he makes in that quotation between the biographer and the undertaker, or the body snatcher, this kind of Gothic comparison, it's a very useful one to think about when looking at biographies of a rather less famous Dublin man, Bram Stoker, whose world-renowned creation, Count Dracula, spends most of his life in a soil-filled coffin. The Count's backstory in the novel is notoriously elusive and difficult to get hold of. And to the exasperation of readers and critics, after the first couple of chapters, he slips away into the shadows for much of the rest of the novel. But interestingly, his creator, Bram Stoker, too, is quite an elusive character, and he left almost nothing on which biographers could create their works, their studies. There's almost nothing really in the primary material that tells us all that much about Bram Stoker. But as is the case with a lot of biographers, the absence of evidence has not been considered evidence of absence. And if even half the things that biographers and critics have acclaimed about Bram Stoker have been true, he would have made a psychoanalyst a very rich person indeed. So unlike Oscar Wilde, who's known the world over, one of the most famous personalities who ever lived, Stoker is the creator of the most famous literary character ever, but on the face of it, he's a relative nobody by comparison. The obvious answer to the question, who is Bram Stoker, is he's the author of Dracula. He's the creator of Dracula. And all the biographies of Stoker start with that basic fact. So let me just briefly run through the existing biographies, just to give you a sense of how they try to get access to this elusive, mysterious character known as Bram Stoker. This is the first one. This is from 1962 by Harry Ludlam, and he calls his biography of Bram Stoker a biography of Dracula, the life story of Bram Stoker. Entity here. Surely Bram Stoker isn't actually Dracula. But Ludlam was well aware at the time that very few people had even heard of Bram Stoker, but everyone had heard of Dracula. So in order to get sales figures up, you need to put Dracula front and center when you're talking about Bram Stoker. The next biographer, Daniel Farson, who was actually a great nephew of Bram Stoker, called his biography The Man Who Wrote Dracula, a biography of Bram Stoker. So there's the answer to the question we started with. Who is Bram Stoker? He's the author of Dracula. He's the man who wrote Dracula. There are three other biographies. This is Barbara Belford's from 1996. Again, she calls her book a biography of the author of Dracula. The most recent one is by David J. Scal, a horror expert. And he provides an extremely interesting title to his. He calls his Something in the Blood, the untold story of Bram Stoker, the man who wrote Dracula. Very cumbersome title in one sense, but it suggests a few things. We have a reference to blood, so we know it's going to be kind of related to something gory, something horror-centric. The title also suggests that there's a secret that's going to be probed here, the untold story of Bram Stoker, and that this secret element of his life is somehow linked to the fact that he's a writer of Dracula. I think that with these titles, we're in danger, really, of losing Bram Stoker himself. Dracula is really front and center. Only one biography, and that is this biography by Paul Merry from 2004, tries to get Stoker out from the shadow of Dracula, A Life of Bram Stoker. But Dracula is still mentioned here in the title, but the indication is that the Count is not actually the key to understanding Stoker, right? That Murray is going to take Stoker away or out from the shadows of his most important creation. But even Murray can't resist the siren call of the Transylvanian Count. When you read the book, you'll find that each of the chapters begins with a quotation taken from the text of Dracula. Now, Stoker scholars have often objected to the ways in which Dracula has taken over when people are writing about the author. The critic and historian Christopher Frayling complains about the titles of all these books about Stoker and says it's as if a book about James Joyce were to be called a biography of Ulysses, or of Oscar Wilde, a biography of Ernest. These are their most famous characters. You don't give a biography of these writers the name of their most famous characters. So why is it happening with Bram Stoker? I should say I actually have quite a lot of sympathy for the Stoker biographers, and I actually agree with the approach that they have taken. I think it's perfectly correct to decide that Stoker's authorship of this Gothic novel is the most important thing to know about him, that anyone should know about him. And I actually don't think that James Joyce and Oscar Wilde are analogous cases. Unlike Joyce and Wilde, for example, with Stoker, we were dealing with someone who created a modern myth. It would be inadvisable to call a biography of James Joyce after Leopold Bloom, because Leopold Bloom has not escaped from the pages of their creation in the same way that Stoker's Dracula has. Stoker's Dracula is not owned by Stoker anymore. He's out into the world in a way that Leopold Bloom and Ernest Worthing are simply not. Now, in the novel that bears his name, Count Dracula says to his enemies, "I spread over centuries, and time is on my side. And he appears to have been right, because even though by the end of the novel, he has apparently been vanquished by the vampire-hating, purity-loving, steak and garlic-wielding do-gooders, Dracula has ultimately triumphed over his antagonists. Popular culture has forgotten the names of Arthur Holmwood, Jonathan Harker, John Seward, Quincy Morris, and Mina Murray, the names of the characters who track him down and ultimately kill him. But Count Dracula is now a name that's known almost anywhere on the planet. In fact, it wouldn't be going too far to say that with Dracula, we're dealing not so much with a fictional character as an epic anti-hero who has broken completely free of the novel which gave him birth. And he's now taken up a kind of permanent habitation in popular culture. Although Dracula was relatively well received when it was first published in 1897, it would have been impossible at that stage to imagine the global impact of this modestly ambitious novel from a man who was then best known as the manager of a great actor called Henry Irving. Not only is Dracula the best known vampire of them all, and we've been living in a veritable vampire craze since the 18th century, he is one of the most recognizable characters in literary history. He's the one most often portrayed in films, bar none. Along with some other characters from 19th century popular culture, like Ebenezer Scrooge, or Oliver Twist, or Sherlock Holmes, or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Count Dracula can now claim this mythic status that everyone will know who he is, even if they've never read the novel in which he first appears. You have to accept, though, I suppose, that this kind of mythic status is in large part due to the mesmeric attraction that he's had for screenwriters and cinema audiences. And even though most who recognize Dracula's name have never read the novel or have heard of Bram Stoker, that should not distract from the cultural significance of the text or the author. The book itself has never been out of print, and it's available in a bewildering variety of versions, mass market paperbacks to collector's editions, which are sold for eye-wateringly large sums of money. One first edition of Dracula recently sold for a staggering $33,460 at auction. And the influence of Dracula can be felt in an astonishing number of bizarre places. He's been transformed into a much-loved television Muppet on Sesame Street, and also into a very sugar-coated breakfast cereal as Count Chocula. Count Chocula is dangerous for your health in a rather different way from Stoker's vampire. In terms of cinematic treatments, the character has found himself in a variety of culturally exotic places. Mid-20th century Japan in Hammer's The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, or 1970s New York as George Hamilton in Love at First Bite, 1970s London as David Niven in Old Dracula, and even into outer space in Dracula 3000. He's simply part of the cultural air we breathe. Despite the fact that the critical establishment tends to look upon any revamping of this classic monster as unnecessary and derivative, the public has an apparently insatiable appetite for new versions of the Count. No matter how many times the critics tell us that these films are no good, audiences keep turning up for them, and the bloodlust shows no sign of being dampened. Ulysses and The Importance of Being Earnest are cultural pygmies by comparison with Dracula. If you ask which has the largest global impact, in this arena, there is no competition. Dracula simply wins hands down. A more telling comparison to make, instead of with Joyce and Wilde, might be to ask how are other authors of horror treated in the biographical marketplace? Let's compare Stoker to someone like Mary Shelley, the writer of Frankenstein. But when you go to biographies of Mary Shelley, you'll find that Frankenstein isn't mentioned in their titles at all. Here's three of them. We have Noel Gearson's Daughter of Earth and Water, a biography of Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. We have Muriel Sparks' titled Mary Shelley, a biography, straightforward, and Anne Mellor's Mary Shelley, Her Life, Her Fiction, Her Monsters. Her Monsters probably comes closest to mentioning Frankenstein, but even here we don't get the name check directly. What about Robert Louis Stevenson, the creator of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. What are the biographies of Stevenson called? Here too we find disappointment if we look for the name checking of Jekyll or Hyde. We get Robert Louis Stevenson, a biography, or A Life of Robert Louis Stevenson, myself, and the other fellow. I suppose that's close to referencing Jekyll and Hyde. We get Dreams of Exile, but we don't get something like Hiding Stevenson, which would be a good name, I think, but we don't get the reference to Jekyll and Hyde directly. So clearly, even in analogous figures like Shelley and Stevenson, Stoker biography is different, precisely because of the way Dracula is allowed to dominate, not only in the titles, but inside the biographies themselves. So when you read Stoker biographies, you find that Dracula keeps popping up everywhere in the accounts of his life. And practically anything and everything that could be related to the novel is related to it. And these are even very mundane things. So this is Stoker's childhood home in Clontarf, County Dublin. And we're told that the view from this childhood home, the view of the sea, may have influenced his writing of the Whitby scenes in Dracula. Every relationship he had, all his family relationships, all his friendships, they're all combed through by the biographer to see, is there a way to relate it to the novel? Each of these characters in his life are thoroughly examined to see which of them could possibly be related to the Transylvanian Count. Even his relationship with his wife, Florence Balcombe. This here is an image of Florence Balcombe as drawn by Oscar Wilde. We're told that this woman, his wife, fueled the two main female characters in Dracula, Mina and Lucy. There's a sense in which Dracula looms so large that it becomes a kind of interpretive key to Stoker's life. And moreover, this kind of decoding of Stoker's life is found not just in biography, but it's found in what's often called Dracula studies. Dracula studies, where literary critics examine the text of Dracula. This is chock full of critics who begin with the imagery of a Gothic novel about vampires and end up with a diagnosis of the real person, Bram Stoker, and talking about what he was like in his real life. Now, I should say that I don't have any real objection to this kind of biography, this way of trying to get inside the head of a writer. Particularly when you have very little to go on in terms of the primary material that a writer might have left. You might find yourself depending quite a lot on the books that the author left us. Stoker left very little in terms of material with which to construct a credible interior life or an inner life for a biographer. So all biographers have turned to the literary text, and indeed this one text, this novel, as a starting point for drawing a convincing and sustained psychological profile of Stoker. Now, interestingly, Stoker left something like 500,000 letters behind, but only 2 of them are personal letters. All the rest of them are business letters in which he reveals almost nothing of himself. So we've only got 2 personal letters left behind. So turning to his fiction then is absolutely essential, I suppose, if a biographer is to get anything out of Bram Stoker at all. I would caution about one very serious problem, though, and this is that there is a tendency to assume that writers of horror are weirder people than the rest of us, that there must be something inherently odd about someone who writes about bloodsuckers and people being staked and what the other things that Stoker wrote about in other novels, things like white worms and Egyptian mummies. We tend to feel that an interest in horror is indicative of some kind of pathology at the heart of the horror writer. That for someone to come up with the kinds of things you find in horror novels, that must mean that they're strange and odd themselves. So, for example, the treatment of the women in Dracula has often been put forward as evidence that Stoker was a misogynistic, sex-hating Puritan who harbored repressed, murderous designs on anyone who stepped outside a very strict sexual code. There's a sense in which Stoker comes through in Dracula. What evidence is provided for this? Well, if you remember in the novel, Lucy is proposed to by three eligible bachelors: Dr. Seward, a Texan called Quincy Morris, and Arthur, who she eventually agrees to marry. And she jokingly complains to her friend Mina that she wishes she could marry all three of them. She says, why can't they let a girl marry three men, or as many as want her, and save all this trouble? Then Lucy goes on to be vampirized and bitten by Dracula, and then brutally staked by the Crew of Light. And many critics have argued that this is how Stoker punishes Lucy, because she briefly expressed a desire to have more than one sexual partner. And that therefore Stoker hates women who step outside a very strict sexual code. Here is one critic of what she's written about Stoker and women. Stoker portrays a new woman as dangerously parasitic and morally unsound. This is a typical representation of the opinion held by many Victorian males, and indeed many females, not of the new woman's generation or bold disposition. Many men felt that their masculinity and authority was being challenged and would eventually be stolen by women who would regard them as equals, not as masters. They were seen to be a dangerous threat to male dominance and to the very fabric of Victorian society. In Dracula, Stoker deals with representatives of the new woman in the way Stoker believes all new women should be, by being destroyed. We see in Mina Harker how Stoker feels a Victorian lady should behave in order to remain in favour with male society. Mina is a mother figure and is obsequiously loyal to her menfolk. This ensures her survival in the novel. So we move here from a potential interpretation of a novel as misogynistic to a view of Stoker as not just misogynist, but murderous in his misogyny. And I think this is a grave mistake. Using a novel to understand an author is tricky at the best of times. And when dealing with a writer of horror fiction, it's dangerous. Because if you're writing horror, you're duty bound to include all kinds of nasty, disgusting, and horrific material. And this is going to lead some people to interpret the writer as nasty, disgusting, and horrific themselves. So we need to be careful not to jump too quickly from the text to the author and interpret the one through the other. Now, blurring the difference between the horror genre and the horror writer is very common. One philosopher points out that an interest in horror fiction strikes many people as being morally offensive, or at the very least, a sign of immature character development, and especially puerile, if not perverse, passions and sensibilities. Since horror fans infrequently regard their own aesthetic tastes in this light, the challenge in this case is to understand why a prevalent aesthetic activity can be celebrated so unabashedly by its participants, while being viewed by others with moral condemnation, aversion, and disdain, or only rarely with indifference. Now, if horror fans are considered freakish, horror writers are often considered even worse. Horror writers are often explicitly asked, what is wrong with you that you write fiction like this? Famously, Stephen King says that the question he's most often asked is, why do you write that stuff? He likes to tease questioners and responds usually, the first reason is because I'm warped, of course. He's often told the story of Robert Bloch, the author who first wrote Psycho, turned into the film by Alfred Hitchcock, who was also repeatedly asked this question, why do you write that kind of stuff? And he used to reply, actually, I have the heart of a small boy. I keep it in a jar on my desk. Now, Bloch's answer was facetious, of course, but it came out of boredom with the requirement to explain what was wrong with him because he wrote horror fiction. No. And I think that suspicion about the mental health of the writer is often quite particular to those associated with the horror genre. If horror writers are considered weird, are writers of soap operas melodramatic in their domestic life.
Oh, you're back. Okay, good. Jarlath, we missed a teensy bit about maybe you were saying your man's answer was facetious about having the heart.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Okay.
I didn't hear what
sorry.
exactly his response was, but I'm assuming it's facetious.
Yes. So Bloch said when he was asked this question, what's wrong with him that he writes this stuff. Bloch is the author of Psycho. He used to reply that he had the heart of a small boy and he kept it in a jar on his desk. He was kind of bored with being asked this question. I suppose the point, one of the questions I would have here is why do we think that's something necessarily strange about the horror writer? Do we think that, do we think that someone who writes romance novels, do we think that they're very romantic in their real life? Or people who write soap operas, do we think they're melodramatic in their real life? We don't tend to mix them up with their real lives up with their fiction, but we certainly tend to mix up the horror writer with their fiction, their real life with their fiction. When King is asked this question, he says that there's nothing strange about him at all. He said, I live a very ordinary life. I have the children and I have the wife, except for this thing that I do, this glitch. It's a very ordinary life. And in a sense, that's what I'd like to say about Bram Stoker as well. Unlike Mary Shelley or Robert Louis Stevenson, who are extraordinary people in many ways, Stoker was almost the epitome of the ordinary man. There's almost nothing fascinating about Bram Stoker, except for the fact that he was the writer of Dracula. Now, that's not meant as an insult. There's nothing wrong with having an ordinary life. Most of us live ordinary lives of one kind or another. I certainly do. That doesn't mean that you don't find yourself endlessly fascinating. When ordinary people die, there's not that much to say about them. And when we look at the obituaries of Bram Stoker that were published after his death, we find that they don't really have much to say about him either. He died in 1912, April 1912, and obituaries highlighted his business management of an intimate friendship with Henry Irving, who was the greatest actor of the late Victorian stage. And he was far more famous than Bram Stoker at the time. So when Stoker died, all the obituaries talk about his relationship with the great actor, the great actor. So here's one example. This is from the New York Times. And straight away, the first sentence talks about Bram Stoker, author, theatrical manager, close friend and advisor of the late Sir Henry Irving, died in London last Sunday. For 27 years, he was the business manager in charge of the Lyceum Theatre, while Irving was joined Irving's tenancy of that house. And it's interesting to know, if you look at this obituary, Dracula is hardly mentioned. Dracula is just mentioned as one book in a long line of all the other books that Stoker published. Now, the London Times was slightly more expansive. You probably can't read this very well. It's probably too big. But again, I'll summarize it. It concentrates on his relationship with Henry Irving. Henry Irving's the most important person in this obituary, and Stoker isn't all that important. It notes that as a young man, Stoker was a civil servant when he was living in Dublin. He was employed as an inspector of the courts of petty sessions. That was his main source of income while he was young. And this was a job that essentially meant that he was a public servant, a civil servant, a bureaucrat of one kind or another. He then met Henry Irving, and Irving convinced him to come to London and manage this acting. Now, the obituary insists that without Henry Irving, Stoker would probably have stayed in the Irish civil service for the rest of his life, occupied by those humble, though miscellaneous parts, is what it claims about him. Now, I actually don't think he would have been content to be a civil servant for the rest of his life, not because I think there's anything wrong with being a civil servant. I should hasten to add, as a lecturer in the paid employment of the public service, I'm a great admirer of the unsung greatness of public and civil servants. But I do think that Stoker would have eventually grown bored with the kind of job that he had there. But thanks to Irving, he was invited to London, and then he got to mix with the great and the good. And he worked very closely with someone who was considered a genius. But the obituarist had no interest really in Stoker's talents. He didn't think that Stoker certainly had any great literary talents. Most people, when Stoker died, thought the most important thing the most important book he'd ever written was his biography of Henry Irving, rather than Dracula. And they all go on about this 2-volume biography of Henry Irving as the really crucial thing that he left behind. So Stoker, in the obituaries, is beside an interesting person. He's not an interesting person himself. He works beside an interesting person. And what I've been saying so far is that in the biographies of of Bram Stoker, they also put him beside a more interesting person. Instead, this more interesting person is not Henry Irving, it's actually Dracula. And together, Irving and Dracula have edged Stoker out of the picture in many ways. They've attracted much more of attention than he has, even when Stoker himself is supposedly the person under discussion. This is a picture with Henry Irving there is in the centre. He's about to get into a cab, and there's Stoker right behind him, following. Many of the biographies of Stoker often claim that he based Dracula on Irving, so that kind of Irving is Dracula and Dracula is Irving. And this obscures attention to the Irish writer, who often appears almost like an apprentice to a much more fascinating figure, whether it's the Count or whether it's his boss. Part of the problem in trying to get to Stoker is that alongside such great performers as Irving and the Count, he seems rather boring. He seems not to have much personality. The critic Tariq Eagleton has joked that in literary history, the bad guys get all the best lines. Eagleton says that Milton's God sounds like a bureaucratic bore or a constipated civil servant, while his Satan shimmers with mutinous life. He asks, who would like to have an orange juice with Oliver Twist if you could have a glass of beer with Fagin? Of course, Stoker was a civil servant and spent most of his life working as a bureaucrat or administrator of one kind or another. So it's no wonder that critics and biographers find it easy to get distracted from him. Both Irving and Dracula, if they're not essentially the same person, seem much better company than the former inspector of the courts of petty sessions. Dracula, like a few other literary characters, has grown completely independent of his creator and now seems almost self-generated. Stoker's friend, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, was a bit exasperated by the tendency of many fans to refer to Sherlock Holmes as if he was a real person and forget about Arthur Conan Doyle completely. But Stoker, too, was destined to become a kind of hanger-on, a sideline figure to the Count, and even to the other characters populating his great novel. Even in the official sequel, Dacre Stoker's Dracula the Undead, which came out in the last few years, where Stoker actually makes an appearance as one of the characters, he's only a failed author in this book, obsessed with Henry Irving, to whom a crazed Dr. Van Helsing revealed the original story in order to keep in circulation the knowledge of how to destroy the vampire. At one point in this novel, a frustrated Mina Harker complains, "Damn it, who the hell was this Bram Stoker guy?" Likewise, in Elizabeth Kostova's international bestseller, The Historian, which is about Count Dracula, Stoker's novel is a derivative and melodramatic treatment of a real and extraordinary charismatic person. Not Stoker, of course, the vampire. In both of these cases, Stoker's association with Dracula is accidental or fortuitous, for Stoker that is, an otherwise boring man who is lucky to have bumped into a figure of such monumental and charismatic power. And here's a controversial bit from my side of things, from an academic side of things. I think there's a good deal of truth to these characterizations. I'm sure that Stoker was a good friend, an entertaining companion, a worthy person. I don't think he was an oddball. But while these qualities are certainly estimable, they are not enough to make him interesting as a character to anyone else. Where would Stoker be without Dracula? He was a minor figure in literary history without this novel. As one critic memorably pointed out, no one except a maniac would claim that Stoker was a particularly great writer. His novels are often tedious, over or underplotted, sometimes nonsensical, confusing, confused. And I've read them all. There are 13 of them. And I have to admit that the only good one is Dracula. So Dracula, as much as it is a Gothic masterpiece, it's almost like it's a kind of fluke. Without Dracula, interest in Stoker would not have survived his death. At this stage, he would just have been a footnote in literary history or theatrical history, meriting almost no mention whatsoever. Mm-hmm. So the answer to the question, who was Bram Stoker then, is correctly given as Bram Stoker is the man who wrote Dracula. Now, the objection that arises to the answer is that surely the man who wrote Dracula cannot have been an ordinary man, even if on the outside he appeared to be ordinary. He must have been a raging torrent of emotions and psychological complexity beneath the surface. There seems to be a gap, in other words, between Bram Stoker, the genial, trustworthy, hardworking, loyal civil servant and administrator, and Bram Stoker, the man who wrote one of the most extraordinarily influential horror novels of all time. How do we fit these two people together? Christopher Frayling asks, how on earth did this conventional, genial ex-civil servant from Dublin come to possess such a bizarre Gothic imagination as to produce Dracula? Now, the decision has been made in relation to how do you bridge this gap between the two figures. The answer has been that internally, he's much more complicated, that he's a psychologically disturbed person, even if that is not apparent on the outside. And because we lack any real material for insight into his mind, because he left us so few personal pieces of evidence, and because he wrote the most famous Gothic novel ever written, his life has become the subject of the most extraordinary analysis. And before I tell you what some biographers have claimed about Stoker, it's important for me to clarify that it is because he was a horror novelist that he's attracted such strange attention. The Gothic, with its emphasis on the dark and shadowy depths, running alongside the world of light and shadow, has always been associated with the language of repression, with things that are done in the darkness of the night, with secrets that need to be revealed. Many of the most famous works in the horror and Gothic canon have been associated with nightmares or bad dreams. For example, in her preface to Frankenstein, Mary Shelley tells us that the book was inspired in part by a horrible nightmare that jolted her awake. Anne Radcliffe, probably the greatest 18th century writer of horror, used to eat rich food before going to bed in order to induce nightmares, which would provide inspiration for her material. And according to one of the first biographers of Bram Stoker, Dracula came to him in a dream after he had eaten a dinner of dressed crab. In other words, Dracula was a kind of personal nightmare. And nightmares are the psychoanalysts' stock in trade. That's what analysts analyze when they're looking at people's traumas and their neurosis. And given these kinds of stories, there has been a temptation to treat Gothic fiction as a kind of dream work and to be analyzed through the language of psychoanalysis. And indeed, Stephen King, just to go back to him briefly, he seems to kind of support this idea that horror is a kind of psychoanalytic nightmare needing to be unpicked. He describes horror as the dream of horror as an outletting and a lancing. It may well be that the mass media dream of horror can sometimes become a nationwide analyst's couch. It's a kind of Freudian view that anxieties and fears that are too difficult to be faced by an individual or a culture are repressed and then emerge in Gothic or horror fiction has been very influential in terms of how literary critics have approached the great canon of Gothic fiction. If Gothic is all about repression, then the writers of Gothic must have been repressed. people, as I said, who write horror fiction are always being asked what's wrong with them. What is this stuff that they're repressing? If they are sick, if they're repressed, then maybe the biographer or critic can be the physician who can figure out what's wrong with them. And Stoker is a great test case for this approach, since he left so little to contradict psychobiographical speculation. And it's also important to say that psychoanalysis is great fun when you start it. So you can almost go anywhere with this kind of stuff. So let's see, for example, what can be done with that supposed nightmare about a crab that Stoker had after he ate dressed crab, which supposedly is the basis of Dracula. That seems to be kind of slim pickings, dressed crab causing a nightmare. What can you do with it? Well, psychoanalysts are great at using slim pickings. So we have a psychiatrist called Joseph Bierman, who's provided a brilliant example of the inventiveness of biographical speculation here. This is his argument. Okay, so crab, when viewed horoscopically, is that sign of the zodiac that covers the period between June the 23rd and July the 23rd. George, Bram Stoker's youngest brother, was born under the sign of the crab on July the 20th. Eating the dressed crab meant unconsciously eating up and killing George. Now, suddenly, we have a much more interesting Stoker here, someone who's filled with sibling rivalry, so much so that it manifests in a novel he wrote in his adult years. Now, another interesting thing about Stoker, and possibly the most interesting thing about Stoker, is that he suffered from a very strange childhood illness. He claims that when he was young, he was extremely weak all the time, so weak that he spent most of his life in bed. He says that till I was 7 years old, I never knew what it was to stand upright. Now, if that's true, then the first 7 years, he was effectively bedridden, possibly near to death. And that must have affected him psychologically, since it means he never went through the normal childhood experiences of learning to walk or to toddle. And he was instead carried everywhere by his family and lived on sofas and beds. His early years then were those of an invalid, though exactly what was wrong with him remains something of a mystery. For the psychoanalyst, this illness was completely psychosomatic. Okay, there was nothing physically wrong with him. It was all caused by this intense sibling rivalry that he had with his brothers. And Bierman finds evidence for this diagnosis in Dracula, which he claims is all about death wishes. And it has as one of its most vivid scenes an image of the Count forcing Mina to suck blood from his chest. It's around the middle of the novel. Count Dracula attacks Mina Harker. He opens a wound in his chest and he pushes her face into it and makes her suck and drink his blood. Sucking blood from the chest is similar to sucking milk from the breast. So vampirism and breastfeeding are connected together in this analysis. And for Bierman, this tells us something personal about Stoker. He speculates that because of this crippling illness, Stoker may have been kept in his parents' bedroom and therefore would have had to have witnessed his mother breastfeeding his younger brother and would have been irritated by this and jealous. And also he would have wanted to get rid of the baby making sounds in order to stay asleep. And he expands on this with the argument that the whole obsession in Dracula with bloodletting and bleeding has its source in the illness of the author as a young boy, because he would have been bloodlet himself in an attempt to cure him of his illness. And this is this quotation I provided from this analysis. The bloodletting would have been experienced by him first as being eaten up and then as castration threat. This would set the stage for increased castration anxiety and fixation for regression to oral fantasies, especially with a long period of time, if only even in his fantasies, of being the dependent child unable to stand on his own 2 feet or to stand erect in the physical and or phallic sense. He would have experienced the birth of 4 brothers before he was 7, thus being afforded ample opportunity for seeing his mother pregnant and his brother's nursing, and shaping his rivalrous and angry feelings about the babies at the breast. Okay, well, and that's not all. And that's not all. That's not all that the psychoanalytic critics have come up with. In the 1970s, another critic called Seymour Schuster speculated that the writing of Dracula was caused by the emergence of Stoker's long repressed anxiety relating to childhood experiences with doctors. In other words, the puzzling illness he had when a child caused Stoker to be very suspicious of doctors for the rest of his life. Stoker, according to this analysis, Jonathan Harker's terror and helplessness in Castle Dracula is like that of the child who had been left by his mother in a hospital to undergo surgery and/or bloodletting. The vampire's bite is very like the jab of a needle into the skin of a terrified child. And in case this is unclear, the critic explains that Dracula is a doctor, and you know this by the first two letters of his name, Dr, meaning doctor. For another psychoanalytic speculator, more was going on in Stoker's home than just bloodletting and examination. Stoker, according to this analysis, was being abused, possibly sexually, and this abuse caused his illness and later manifested in writing Dracula. The clinical psychologist, Daniel Lapin, is an expert in child sexual abuse, and he's treated many patients over the years. And he claims that the stories told to him in his surgery echo the language of Stoker's novel. Therefore, Stoker's novel must have been written by someone who was sexually abused. And the abuser in Stoker's life, who formed the basis of the character of Count Dracula, according to this analysis, is Stoker's father. Now, of course, you would have to logically expand this out because since horror novels in general sound quite like the stories found in true narratives of child abuse, that would suggest that all horror novels are written by people who have been abused as a child. I can't see how something can necessarily be true of Stoker and not true of every other horror writer. And there we see, I think, the problem with these kinds of analysis, because the evidence for them is so thin and so based on the text of a horror novel that it becomes impossible to believe them. Now, in one sense, they're admirable because they're so daring. I'm kind of blown away by the audacity of some of these critics. I would never have thought of this kind of analysis myself, so I'm kind of jealous that this kind of argument can be made. But these are really just the tip of the psychoanalytic iceberg. Dracula has been an exemplary test case for the psychosexual biographer and scholar. Stoker has been completely put on the doctor's couch retrospectively, and he's come out very badly from this analysis. And if everything psychobiographers have said about him is true, he would have made a lucky analyst very rich indeed. He's been accused of Oedipal desires, childhood sexual trauma, repressed homosexuality, deep-seated misogyny, castration anxiety, sibling rivalry, incest desires, a sexless marriage. All these things have appeared as explanations of Dracula itself. Speculations about Stoker's psychological health have undoubtedly left a bad taste in the mouths of some. One critic has described all this conjecture as being so much nonsense. This psychosexual approach to Stoker, where his work is read as an articulation of personal pathology or anxiety, has provoked concerns for some of us. When all kinds of neuroses are read back into the life of a dead writer, and his writings used as a kind of dream work, so that the psychoanalytic critic can feel free to come up with all kinds of anxieties and neuroses for the dead writer, surely some kind of category mistake has been made. Horror novels are meant to be full of horrible, disgusting, disturbing material because they're horror novels. They're not necessarily telling us anything about the writer himself or herself, other than they may be particularly good at this kind of material. Maybe horror novelists write this kind of material because that's what they're good at. not because of anything particular in themselves. However, the psychoanalysis of the novel and the author has at least had the merit of attracting attention to someone who might otherwise be forgotten, even if the attention has tended to make him sound a lot stranger than he actually was. Before attempting a psychoanalytic reading of any Stoker's novels, I think it's important to avoid making unqualified claims about repressed sexuality and Victorian culture's attitude to the body. And I also think it's very dangerous to start speculating about things like whether Stoker's father was an abuser. It's unacceptable in my mind to label anyone an abuser without some very, very strong means of verification and substantiation. Claims that Stoker hates his brothers or hated his brothers needs to be based on stronger support than the ridiculous story that Dracula was caused by a nightmare generated by eating crab. And also it has to deal with the evidence that in fact, Stoker got on quite well with his brothers when in his adult life. Far from feeling sibling rivalry with them, he appears to have been quite friendly with them. Readings of Dracula as a misogynistic text and that Stoker was a misogynist needs to deal with the fact that he also got on very well with women in his real life and was a supporter and friend to many marginalized women whose unorthodox sexual life would have caused them to be rejected by many of the more mainstream Victorian writers. I think we need to be careful and deal with Stoker with real evidence and not just with Dracula. Okay, I'm gonna wrap it up there and just conclude by saying that, just to reiterate that my answer to the question, who is Bram Stoker, is that he was the man who wrote Dracula, but that does not mean that he was a fascinating mixture of psychological neurosis. So we need to deal with him as what I think he was, which is an ordinary bureaucrat, an administrator, and face up to that. There's nothing shameful in being this kind of ordinary figure. Thank you for listening to me, and I'm happy to take any questions.
That was fantastic. I was nodding away in the background here, and I've taken loads of notes because you've touched on so many different topics. So if anyone wants to ask a question, you just type it into the Q&A at the bottom, and I'll keep an eye on that. But I do have questions. Now, I have to admit, Jarlath, it's years since I read it, and I read it in UCD, and I can't remember who was teaching the novel at the time, but am I right in thinking it, like, the novel isn't great? It was almost like 2 or 3 different styles, so you have the Jonathan bits. There's epistoliology, with the writing the letters, or it's an epistolic, novel. Then you've got all that Romanian influence with Vlad Tepes. Maybe he was based on a real, dictator or whatever he was, freedom fighter in Romania, Transylvania. And subsequently, I've read a lot of things that suggested, maybe his mother had lived through or had heard stories in Sligo about an earlier famine. And so, she had these kind of terrible Sligo superstitions that kind of got melted into the mix. And of course, maybe he had visited the crypts in St. Michan's or Mycian's church in Dublin. So the book is maybe poorly constructed, but the character is fantastic. This one character who kind of overtakes everything else, because as you say, we forget really the rest of the characters. And so this anti-hero, and then of course that has spawned a whole new genre. Like, look at all the Anne Rice books, Lestat and all these boys in the Twilight Saga, which I'm sure you hate. But he created a very romantic, I guess, character out of all of this horror, and the fascination with all of the psychoanalysis, I think, is not helpful.
Yeah, so there is I suppose one thing to say about it is the reason it stands out from the other novels. He spent 7 years writing it and researching it. So he devoted a huge amount of time to it, and he read an enormous amount of material in the British Library about vampires, about Romanian history, about superstition, and he plotted it very carefully. So we have the Dracula notebooks, and you can see the development of the story as it was going along. So unlike practically every other novel he wrote, he spent a huge amount of time on this. Now, I should say, I suppose I think it's a great adventure novel. It is quite a page turner. One of the frustrating things about it, but I think one of the kind of fortuitous things for Stoker is that Dracula himself kind of steps off stage for most of it. He's a mysterious figure haunting the margins of the text. But after the first couple of chapters, we don't really hear from him very much again. But that allows you to project a whole host of things onto him. So he becomes a much more kind of frightening and terrifying figure because he's not on the stage all the time. We don't get to hear from him. And he's the only character in the book, for example, that we don't get a diary entry from, or we don't get a letter from, really. We don't really hear from him in the way we do from all the other characters. So he's quite a mysterious, fascinating figure because of that. I should say though that he was originally called, if you look at the notebooks, and I wonder what would have happened if he kept this name. He was originally called Count Wampir. What would have happened?
Not as catchy.
What would have happened if he kept that name? Would we still be talking about Count Wampir today?
Yeah.
I doubt it. He was lucky that he was researching Eastern European history when he was in Whitby. He called for this book, a very dry as dust history, in which it had this note about Vlad Tepes, and it had an asterisk in it, and the note says, Dracula meaning serpent or Satan. And Stoker wrote that note down, and immediately he crosses out Wampir and puts Dracula in. So he cottoned on to the fact that this was going to be a better name. Now, maybe Wampir was always like a placeholder, and he was just looking for a better name. But I wonder what would have happened had he stuck with that original title.
And Jarlath, am I right in thinking too, a lot of people have kind of debunked this whole idea of the Overthok or whatever, there was supposed to be a legend up in Sligo of this blood-sucking guy that had to be staked. Apparently, like, that didn't really exist at all. So this is coming from, Transylvania or Eastern Europe.
Yeah, I think to be honest, the Irish influence has been rather misunderstood. So there's been an attempt to find kind of Irish mythological figures like the Overthok as a way to link Stoker with Irish mythology. I think that that's not the way to go. I think there is definitely, and there's been also, you might have heard this. So Dracula, the name Dracula comes from Dracula.
Oh yeah, I heard that. Genie Mac,
meaning bad blood or something like that.
Yeah, Dracula.
I think that this is, to be honest, I think this is kind of hokum and doesn't work. Yeah. But it's not that I think there's no Irish influences. I think the Irish influences are not those kind of influences. I think they're kind of superficial influences. I think if you think about you mentioned his mother's experiences in Sligo. So what she lived through in Sligo in 1832 was a cholera epidemic. This was in fact, it was a kind of pandemic because it originated elsewhere and sort of came across Europe. And we've lived through a pandemic now ourselves. We know what happens in a pandemic, and this was a much deadlier pandemic than COVID-19. She describes, people being buried alive. She describes, crosses being put on people's houses to say that this house is infected with cholera. But she talks particularly about disease as a kind of infestation, as a kind of monster, sent by God, almost a kind of providential monster. And if you look at the language of disease in the 19th century, it's often described almost like in vampiric terms. So I think he's actually taking some of the imagery of Dracula from the language of disease and pandemic and epidemic, and particularly cholera. And that's where the Irish influence is coming in. He's getting that partly from his mother, partly from the fact that he's living in, he is born in 1847, the worst year of the famine, when disease was all over. There's another pandemic, another epidemic of cholera. No, this may be the childhood illness. This may be the anxiety about his life. You're born into Clontarf in 1847. His parents are reading about the spread of cholera around Ireland. Bodies are piling up, being brought into Dublin by the cartload. It's a very fearful time. We've lived through it. We know how terrifying it is to live through a pandemic, and this was a very deadly epidemic. So,
and hunger wasn't the only killer. Like, they could be touched by typhus or dysentery.
Yes, and the language used about Dracula in the novel is a language of miasma, the language of disease. He leaves a smell in the house, and when he's there, he's in the dust in the air, and there was great fears about breathing in viruses. So there's a lot of the language of disease and epidemic in relation to vampirism, which is a kind of infection.
Just on that, we had a question from one of the attendees. What did he study in Trinity, and what influenced him while he was there?
Well, he claimed to study mathematics, and he claimed to have did a Master of Arts in mathematics, but which he didn't. It's very unclear why he made this claim. He studied the classics. He studied. He didn't spend too much time actually in class. He studied rhetoric. He studied the classics. But in fact, he did fine. He was a fine student. He was a kind of ordinary student. Although the evidence is he spent far much more time in the gym and in the debating room than he ever did in a lecture hall or in the library. So he didn't actually do that much studying, but he was certainly a big fixture in Trinity College life. He was the auditor of the HIST and the president of the PHil. He was the only person in the Trinity's history to have those two roles. These are sort of really important societies in Trinity. The HIST is like the oldest college, a student society in the world. So he spent an awful lot of time in debates there, and he was an athletic champion while he was in Trinity. So he spent a lot of time in the gym. He was a bit of a jock. Actually, he was in Trinity. He was a tall, very good-looking, broad-shouldered, big-chested man. So not much time in the classroom though, but he took a kind of an arts degree, I suppose, what we call it now.
Like the whole thing, the myth and kind of, there's a little element of tragedy, I think, here too, in that, as you say, like he's remembered for this. He's constantly linked, to when in his own life and immediate death, Irving, or then to his creation, which was only one of 13 books. And then am I right in thinking the family kind of are diddled out of basically royalties because American copyright law changed? So that's one of the things that allows Dracula to take off as a character, separate from his novel.
So one of the kind of famous moments in the kind of post Stoker life of Dracula is the first adaptation of Dracula is this famous silent film called Nosferatu. It's adapted. I think it's
creepy. I can't watch it.
Oh yeah, it is. It's actually one of the best. It's one of the best. F.W.
German, I think, was it? Yeah. It was the guy German, the actor.
That's right. That's right. Max Schreck, I think is his name.
Those figures that just I've had enough of the picture.
Yes, it's a German expressionist classic. But if you watch that film, you'll find that none of the names are not. He's not called Dracula. He's called Count Orlok in the novel. In the film. It's because they didn't ask permission. They didn't get permission to make this film. And Stoker's widow sued the distributors of Nosferatu, and she won her case. And the court ordered that all copies of Nosferatu be destroyed. Wow. So legally they shouldn't exist anymore, but some people hid it obviously and kept it in their attic or something. So we still have this classic.
TCM
she was a very canny person, and she was determined to kind of squeeze the any money she could get out of Dracula, because Stoker left her with almost nothing. He didn't leave her with very much. He didn't die a rich man. He wasn't a very wealthy man. So he left her with a lot of debt. And so, in fact, she was quite happy when Hollywood came along and they actually paid her for... Now, they didn't pay her the amount that they made. They made a huge amount. And there was a load of sequels to the Universal Dracula. That was the Bela Lugosi Dracula in the 1930s. But she did make money, at least. And she did start to
I was afraid that like and House of Hammer and all, he just got replicated so much that I
Yes.
thought it had kind of gone beyond their control.
No, they did get, the family did get money.
And now, was he not super good at managing the theatre either? Am I right in thinking that?
Well, that the theatre got into financial difficulties, but he actually managed it quite well for a couple of decades, and he was actually a great manager. But then Irving's stock just went down, as he got older and less and more frail.
Yeah.
And the
And they're
theatre
switching
did
to
become
Nickelodeon
back.
and all this.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, but he was blamed, of course. But he had been managing Irving brilliantly for years, and had made Irving, a very rich man at that stage. So I think he was unfairly blamed for what happened towards the end of his managing of the Lyceum and Irving. He did quite well. He wasn't as good a manager of his own finances. He was much better at managing Irving's.
Oh, good, yeah.
He used to work something like 18 hours a day for Irving. He's a workaholic.
I didn't read Shadow Play, but I saw Joseph O'Connor talk about it. It's kind of a novel based on.
That's right, yeah.
Did you read it, or what did you?
Yes, I think he's it's interesting the way he's kind of hung around. A lot of Irish novelists have kind of returned to Stoker. Neil Jordan is another person, and he sets one of his novels in the house next door to the Clontarf house in which Bram Stoker was born, and there's all this referencing to vampires and to the undead, and it is quite interesting the way he keeps on returning. Irish authors are kind of very interested in the Gothic, and Stoker kind of looms very, very large in that kind of tradition.
And actually, you've just raised another point now, or tweaked. I was thinking that I assume he was a Protestant. But it's quite a Catholic, yes. Now that we're talking about crucifixes and all holy water, the things that you can fight vampires.
That's right.
Quite Catholic. So that's interesting,
Yes, it may be that, to a Victorian Protestant, there's something quite monstrous about Catholicism. If you look
right,
the way.
Exactly. Yeah,
so maybe you need to fight the monster with the monster.
Yeah, it is like, kind of exactly harnessing that superstition power,
That's right.
Yeah.
There's only two Catholics in the novel, and one is Dr. Van Helsing. So he's a Catholic.
Yeah.
He's a Catholic from Amsterdam, interestingly. But all the other characters are Protestant, except, of course, for Dracula, because he's a medieval Catholic, a heretic, but a Catholic nonetheless. He's like a Catholic who's taken transubstantiation and belief in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist almost to really to the nth degree, and is obsessed with drinking blood.
Yeah. Oh God, yeah. I was interested to, when you mentioned the comparison with how Mary Shelley is portrayed in her own or in biographies of her. Do you think, her own life was so kind of scandalous at her time?
Yes.
And even her mom was such a famous person. Is that it, like that they don't have to kind of talk too much about the monster because, just her relationship with her husband was, enough, or her circle of friends was so, kind of crazy?
I think that's it, that she had an extraordinary life.
Yeah.
And she was an extraordinary person. And we have a lot of evidence of what she thought about things. So she was had a voracious interest in the ideas of the time. And she had things to say about them. Similar to somebody like Robert Louis Stevenson, who, who had an extraordinary public life. These are public figures. With Stoker, you just don't have that evidence that he had a rich inner life at all. There's just nothing left behind, and you're just left to speculate.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, two personal letters. They're two letters to Walt Whitman, actually, written while Stoker was still a young man, and they're kind of quite extraordinary letters in which one of them is sent on Valentine's Day, and he describes how he looks naked. He talks about himself as when he's naked, he's 6'4" or something like that, a big broad-shouldered man. He said, I'm like the kind of man that you write about in your poetry. So this has this in itself, spins off into kind of speculation about kind of
homosexuality. Yeah, because Whitman, I think, was, now we're saying, probably gay.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it was very interested in kind of the physically active, muscular kind of figure, and that's why Stoker found himself kind of interested. And a lot of Whitman's poetry is about manly love, like the kind of brotherly love between kind of young men. So Stoker finds himself quite attracted to that idea, and a lot of the heroes of his novels are quite physically impressive men. In another of his novels called The Mysteries of the Sea, which I think is not a bad novel actually. The main character that is always taking his clothes off constantly, and because he looks like he's quite a hunky kind of man. And the women in the novel are always impressed when he takes his shirt off. And even in Dracula, I think Lord Godalming is described at one stage as looking like a figure of Thor.
Oh my God!
He has that kind of Aryan power or masculinity.
Yeah. That's interesting, isn't it? And then I suppose Van Helsing, you're thinking about the other men in the novel. So I think somebody raised a hand there, but they didn't type in a question. Was that you, Samantha? Did you want to ask something? And if you do, you'll have to type it, I'm afraid. So I thought this was fascinating. Did you think, Jarlath, that it was his best written of his books? I know The White Worm, or this. Oh, it is. Oh God.
No, so The White Worm. And that's the other novel that has never been out of print. It says last novel, The Lair of the White Worm, which is about kind of a serpent that emerges from the depths of Britain. That is the weirdest novel I've ever read in my life. It's just bizarre, but bizarrely constructed, bizarrely written. Makes no sense whatsoever, but it's fascinating.
Kind of a succubus type thing. Was the woman?
There is. Yeah. So it's a woman who turns into a white worm.
Lovely.
During the day, you can go to tea with her. In the evenings, she'll turn into a gigantic worm and go into the bowels of the earth. A very, very odd novel in which all kinds of weird and wonderful things happen, but it makes no sense. But I would recommend it. I have to say, I would. For a really weird experience, I would recommend reading The Lair of the White Worm.
Okay, good. You don't think he was on opium or anything, do you?
Well, he was dying at the time, so he was in a lot of pain constantly. He was on his deathbed. He was suffering he was dying of syphilis. I mean, he was definitely dying of tertiary syphilis. So some have speculated that he was kind of his brain was being affected. But in fact, if you look at the proofs of the novel, you'll find that he's correcting the proofs in the same way as he did all his other novels. So I think it's actually just a really weird novel. I think it's meant to be quite weird.
Yeah. And then my last question is, what is your favorite, or do you hate them all, film adaptation of the book?
Oh no, I love a lot of them. I think the best one is probably Nosferatu. I think that's my favorite. But I have a kind of a great affinity for German expressionism. I quite like 1920s silent films, so that's the one I like the best. And then after that, probably the Bela Lugosi Dracula. The film itself is probably not a great film, but Lugosi is just extraordinary. He sets the standard after that. Everyone, if you compare Max Schreck, who played Dracula in Nosferatu, he's a horrible, ugly, rat-faced figure. Then you have Bela Lugosi, this very handsome, very mesmerically attractive man, suave, sophisticated. Suddenly, that's the Dracula we have for the rest of the 20th century. You think like Christopher Lee, Frank Langella, these are very attractive men, beautiful men, and that's the Count we now think of. And he's kind of been played as quite a sexy man ever since then.
Yeah. And every other vampire written almost, all powerful and rich and beautiful, and I think
Anne Rice's vampires are all very beautiful and attractive.
It's funny. I have to say I did have a soft spot for the Gary Oldman, even though it's a bit.
Oh yes.
Oh yeah.
That's a very kind of ostentatious film.
It's very
flamboyant.
Yeah. I kind of got and I loved, while we're on that topic, I loved Kenneth Branagh's Frankenstein.
Yes, again,
same era,
Baroque. You're kind of they're Baroque almost in their presentation.
Yeah. So look, thank you very much for this. Lovely to get us in the mood for Halloween, and I think it is kind of fascinating to think that an ordinary guy can write one of the most famous, and enduring characters, and it's almost like there's a separate. He had this professional life, and maybe an exciting private life, maybe if he died of tertiary syphilis, because I don't think he got that from Francis. But, you know, obviously this creation, you know, has really kind of outlived him, which is, you know,
Yes.
sort of sad, you know, in one way. I should say we're back on, I got to check when we're back. Oh, Sunday. We're having a local author, Lisa LaMonica. She was supposed to be coming to the museum in person, but she's not now. So it'll be 2:00 online. She's going to discuss her book, The Witches and Warlocks of New York. So we're going from, you know, the internationally renowned Dracula to our own local lore here, and keep an eye then for November events. Thank you. I'm going to get some copies of your books, Jarlath, because you've written, you know, several and fantastic edited collections of Gothic stories and stuff. So we'll get some of those into the museum gift shop, so our followers can keep an eye on that. But thank you very much. I'm delighted the technology saved itself.
Yes.
And I know it's late for you at home, so thank you.
No, it's fine. Thank you very much. Take care.